My name is Ryan Litzy. I'm the Assistant Dean for User-Centered Services with the library, and I want to welcome you all to this presentation for Hispanic Heritage Month. This is the second of the 3 presentations that the library is putting on. The third one will be in the new Black Cultural Center within the Peters Family Legacy Library next week. So if you're interested, you can see the schedule on the table here when you came in. Today's presentation is by Lucinda Holt. Born and raised in Lubbock, Lucinda has worked as a contributor to both the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, Lubbock Magazine, and the New York Times, with an emphasis on crime, faith, and breaking news. Lucinda is passionate about assisting her community through media and communication, a passion that was recognized by the Texas Associate Press managing editors for breaking news and feature writing. Lucinda is a mentor, educator, researcher, journalist, and avid volunteer. She is currently the assistant director of the Thomas J. Institute for Hispanic and International Communication, as well as an assistant professor of practice teaching courses in Hispanic media and other journalism-oriented courses. Her current research on COVID, misinformation, and disinformation in Hispanic communities of West Texas is the first Knight Foundation grant received at Texas Tech. Please join me in welcoming Lucinda Holt.
Ryan, can I have that? Is it? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Welcome. Thank you guys for joining me this morning. So, just as Ryan said, my topic is misinformation and disinformation of COVID in Hispanic communities, specifically here among the South Plains, so in West Texas. I'm Lucinda Holt. I'm the Assistant Director for the Thomas J. Harris Institute. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the Knight Foundation, just a little bit of background. So, the Knight Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, is a nonprofit organization that developed in 1940. So they specifically work with journalism, communities, and arts. So if the Knight Foundation sounds familiar to some of you who have been within the College of Media and Communication, as Ryan mentioned, I teach a series of journalism courses, and we use a lot of Knight Foundation tools within our classroom to teach students about immersive journalism and interactive elements, how to incorporate interactive elements in our storytelling. So we have been using the Knight Foundation tools for a very long time. So the grant called for combating misinformation and disinformation in communities of color. So we chose the Hispanic population specifically because of obviously several different reasons, but for me, there's a personal connection because of my own background. So that's my grandmother, Juanita. She came from Hidalgo, Mexico, and that is the only picture I have of my grandparents. So that's my mom and that's my dad. And they were born and raised in Texas. My dad was born in the Austin area, and my mom was born on a ranch in South Texas in the Corpus Christi area. They didn't have a formal education because they were migrant workers. So as you can see, my dad is reading a newspaper. Journalism was really important to him because that was a way he stayed connected, and that was a way to stay educated. Because he didn't have that formal education, education was really important to him. So it wasn't uncommon for him to have daily event quizzes. And so even though they loved the news, they were always watching the news, reading the news, they had a limited vocabulary, meaning information was really hard, difficult to come by, so they really had to work for it. So that's my personal connection to this project. So they would be considered part of the vulnerable community. So now let's look at misinformation and disinformation and even malinformation. So this is called MDM. So misinformation is false, but not created or shared with the intention of causing harm. Disinformation is deliberately created to mislead, harm, or manipulate a person, social group, organization, or country. Then we have malinformation, which is based on fact but used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. So this information comes from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency governmental website. And they wrote, foreign and domestic threat actors use MDM campaigns to cause chaos, confusion, and division. These malign actors are seeking to interfere with and undermine our democratic institution and national cohesiveness. So this is something that the government is looking at. And they've been looking at it even more so since around the 2020 election. So, looking at misinformation among Latinos and Hispanos, during the 2020 election, the Latino-Hispano community was targeted as people spread mis, dis, and even malinformation regarding the election. Most Latinos use Facebook, and Facebook does not flag Spanish language content as thoroughly as they do English content. So for instance, in this particular study conducted by Avaz, meaning voice, 70% of English content on social media on Facebook was flagged. 30% of Spanish content with comparable messaging was flagged. So you can see that disconnect there. So Avaz is a global activism nonprofit organization. So here are some articles that I was able to use as an example for this particular talk. So if you look, we have two stories from NBC News. We have Miami Herald apologizes for racist anti-Semitic Spanish language insert. So that was actual misinformation, malinformation that was shared through the Miami Herald, which is a trusted news organization. So then we also have Spanish language disinformation intensifies among Florida Latinos worrying Democrats. And then we also have information spreading about QAnon. And this article in the lower right-hand side is from Politico. Florida Latinos swamped by wild conspiracy theories. So you can see it really amped up around the 2020 election. So another report was released months into the pandemic, and again, this was done by Avaz. So what they did was they looked at misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation Facebook sites within the span of a year. I believe it was from May 2019 to May 2020. And here we have how many hits were received by certain Facebook sites that spread misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So if you look, the number one site with the most views, we have over 100 million clicks, is Dr. Joseph Mercola en Español. So the number one misinformation, disinformation, malinformation site was actually in Spanish. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Joseph Mercola, he is behind a lot of the COVID-19 vaccination conspiracies, such as, you know, if you get vaccinated, they're going to implant a tracking device within your arm. So that's the type of content you can find on his site. When we're talking about monetization, his site also has a Spanish language shop where he sells natural remedies to help with COVID-19. So as you can see, the messaging has severe implications. So now I want to jump into our current data. So this is the front page of the Houston Chronicle. As you can see, the headline is Demographic Milestone. So according to the 2020 Census Bureau data, the Latino population reached 62.1 million. That's about 19% of the population. Recent data for Texas shows the Latino population beating out the white non-Latino population by 1%. 13.2% of US residents speak Spanish at home. That's according to 2020 census data. And 28.8% of Texas families reported speaking Spanish at home. So you can see that the Latino population is growing. This is from a Nielsen report. If you're not familiar with Nielsen reports, they kind of gauge media to see what, the average American household, how they use media. So they look at media consumption. So they write, U.S. Hispanics are more likely than non-Hispanic whites to consume local, evening, morning, and late news. So just like my parents. However, looking at the same report, 23% of participants said they searched for medical information within the past 30 days. Okay, so they're taking what they're seeing on TV, but they're not doing any additional research. With the majority of Latino Hispano homes being multi-generational, information in both English and Spanish is critical to family communication, okay? Because we have, in some cases, an older grandparent who speaks nothing but Spanish. And then we may have a bilingual mom and dad, bilingual children, and then maybe English-only grandchildren. So we need messaging in both English and Spanish in order to communicate effectively within these families. So continuing on with the Nielsen report, 92% of Latino respondents have a smartphone. So if you look at this graph, Facebook is the #1 platform. Okay, they use Facebook to keep in touch with family and friends. Latinos, Hispanos are family oriented, so this is just another way for them to communicate with one another and share information. So we have multi-generational families in one household, and we have these families getting information from Facebook. They're clicking on sites like Dr. Joseph Mercola because he has the #1 misinformation, disinformation site on Facebook. And then we see mis and disinformation spread among Latino communities. COVID-19 took its toll. So this is recent data from the CDC website. So as you can see here, January 8th, 2022, we have 1,668 Hispanics affected by COVID-19 compared to 767. Okay, so Hispanics are in the green, and I don't know if you guys can see this, it may be kind of faint, but they have continuously spiked throughout this data. 15.7% of COVID-19 deaths were Latino. 40.4% of COVID-19 deaths in Texas were Latino. So now I'm going to jump into Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. 2 South Plains counties made the list for 20 counties with the highest death rates. 1 South Plains county made the list for 20 counties with the highest infection rates. Moving on to a Pew study, Pew shows 52% of Latino adults said they had a friend or loved one who was hospitalized or died from COVID-19. And the CDC shows Latinos, Hispanos are at greater risk of hospitalization or death from COVID-19. And we know that Latinos are frontline workers, but again, as a journalist, I can't help but think of narratives. We had the narrative of the essential employee. So about us, this is my team. I'm not working on this alone. So We have Dr. Kent Wilkinson, who is the director of the Thomas J. Harris Institute. And then we have Dr. Ryan Litzy, who is the Assistant Academic Dean for Texas Tech University Libraries. And they are my co-PIs on this project. So Dr. Wilkinson has a long history of health communication research, and Dr. Litzy has a wealth of knowledge coming from the university library system, and so they are able to contribute their backgrounds to this story, or I'm sorry, to this research to help us with this boots on the ground initiative. So the problem, 37.7% of the Lubbock population identifies as Latino, but the South Plains lacks sufficient Spanish language outreach. Looking at the media landscape, there is one Spanish language television station that shares local news, 2 Spanish language radio stations, 1 bilingual weekly paper, and 1 monthly bilingual news magazine that focuses on Hispanic issues in the region. So as you can see, we have a growing population, but where are they getting their information from? Okay, so with our project, we have reached out to influencers who agreed to the mission. Okay, these are, I mentioned boots on the ground, these are media influencers or community influencers that are among the people, and they get where they're coming from. They understand the situation, they see firsthand what's going on, and they're using their positions to try to help. So we reached out to them so they could share their insight. So we had a focus group with influencers to gauge attitudes. Now we are interviewing the Spanish-speaking audience to gauge attitudes and to see where they receive information. So for instance, we're going to local church events. We were at El Grito last week, and we want to see what health perceptions are like among the Latino Hispano community. We want to know what type of media they're consuming, okay? The next phase of this is production. So we plan on producing media content that they can use. We're looking at Spanish language media with English reinforcement, because I just said we have multi-generational families in a household, and oftentimes we see, older Hispanics who speak Spanish, only they don't speak English, and they're using the younger generation to translate for them. So that's why that's really important. So we're going to produce news stories, narratives. We're going to use social media, print, broadcast to try to hit every single audience segment in this particular audience group. So our goal is to produce media kits as well for government agencies and to help distribute that information and train them so they know how to reach out to this particular community. Oh, sorry. So then we're also going to conduct some post-interviews to see whether or not the media messaging worked, how we can improve, what we can do better, and then we will work on continued production. So looking at public relations within the city of Lubbock, the city of Lubbock is the only government entity here within the South Plains that consistently produces Spanish language messaging within the 14,000 square mile area. So during COVID-19, the church also served as a critical source of information. So when we were going into this project, we were looking at the narrative of faith over fear. We wanted to see what type of messaging, if any messaging, that the churches were distributing. And we found out that the Catholic Diocese here in Lubbock was actually educating people on COVID-19, and they were also bringing vaccination clinics to the church. This is Father Martin Pina. He is one of our community influencers. And this photo actually came from the CDC website because Lubbock was highlighted for their community efforts. Father Martin Pina, his picture was posted on the side of a bus to try to reach the Latino community. So if we look, church is valued biculturalism, and religious faith was used to handle daily assimilation stress. So the church has been used for messaging for a really long time, sometimes to help in the assimilation process. But when COVID-19 happened, the Catholic diocese stepped up, and at this particular church, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Father Martin Pina knew that a lot of his parishioners were older and they listened to radio. Again, looking at the Nielsen reports that gauges media consumption, Latinos are highly interested in radio. So Father Martin Pina used the radio to reach his audience. So he would broadcast daily mass, and he would also share messaging and information regarding COVID-19. Then we have our broadcast elements. We have radio and TV. This is Jennifer Martinez, Chismosa with Magic 106.5, and this is Vince El Cucuy Carrillo, and they are radio personalities, and they are well known within the Latino Hispano community. So as you can see here, they had some swag, Magic 106.5 swag, as a way to grab the audience and have them mask up. So if you look, I don't know if you can see, but their masks actually have the Magic 106.5 logo to help promote wearing your mask. So we also interviewed them as well for this project, because media, Spanish language media or information was even hard for them, or hard for them to reach. So they had to do a lot of the research in most of these cases in order to inform their public. So what they would do is they would receive the information in English, and they would translate it, and not only translate it, but put it in terms that the audience can understand in order for it to be considered effective messaging. And then we also have print and TV. We have Councilwoman Christy Martinez Garcia, who is also one of our influencers. So she is regularly on KLBK's Trends and Friends, and she also has Latino Lubbock Monthly magazine. And she was an advocate for Spanish language messaging at a lot of these council meetings. So, you know, whenever the health department would produce information about COVID-19 statistics and data, it was coming across in English, and so she really championed for that to be produced in Spanish as well, to make sure we are touching all of our audience groups. So like I said, we're also going to use social media as a platform, because we know social media is really important. A lot of Latinos use Facebook. I believe it said 92%, more than 90% have a smartphone, and most of those people use Facebook to engage. And the big thing here is representation. So it goes beyond languages. We need that cultural representation as well. So we are doing interviews. As I mentioned earlier, we've been going to a series of church functions. And so I have a couple of audio clips that I would like to share with you guys. In order to protect our respondents, their information has been removed. But I did want to share this with you guys. So the first place we went to was Plainview. And this is where we began to see the impact of our study. People were really emotional during our interviews.
¿Por qué?
Porque están matando personas que no se quieren vacunar y se mueren. Se han muerto, yo conocidos míos se han muerto muchos. Aquí murió un muchacho de 23 años.
23.
No tenía vacuna.
So the question was, do you believe that misinformation, disinformation is a problem in Latino communities? And the respondent said yes, because people are not getting vaccinated. And he knew a 23-year-old who died and was not vaccinated because of this misinformation, disinformation that he received. In Crosbyton, it was kind of a different situation. It's been really interesting, because even though we are within the South Plains, the audience has been different every place we go. So in Crosbyton, we saw, or I saw at least, a little more distrust regarding the media. And there were some interviewees that just flat out said, we're tired of it. We're tired of talking about it. So one quote that stood out to me, and again, I'm listening to this, when I'm conducting these interviews, I still have kind of like a journalistic ear. What stands out? What are people saying? And one thing that stood out was, how can I lecture if I don't have an audience?
Well, I can't lecture if I don't have the knowledge. You know, if I don't. I mean, you know, I'm not a. How can I tell you, hey, you got to do this, do that, when I don't know for sure that's what you got to do?
So I know that's a little difficult to hear. I apologize, but he said, "How can I lecture if I don't have if I don't have an audience? How can I give you information if I don't know the truth?" Essentially. And then in Lubbock, we have representation, a call for representation. And again, it goes beyond linguistics. Sometimes it helps to see somebody that looks like you, someone you can identify with, in order for the messaging to be effective.
But you don't see that in every person they interview. You know, people that they interview, some of them are real smart, real intelligent. You can tell they know what they're talking about. Interview more of those people. So the Hispanic community can see, hey, they're representing us, they're smart, they have answers, they know things. Mm-hmm. I don't think we see enough of that. We don't see enough of that.
So you would like to see more representation?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and the people who have knowledge, people who know things, people to communicate that more through media would be great. You know, so instead of Dr. Ron Cook always being the one who presents on the stuff being done regarding COVID, remember during COVID he was the main one all the time. That's it. Where's the Hispanics? There were other doctors.
So that particular interviewee said that, and I trimmed it for the sake of time, but that particular interviewee said that she is tired that whenever something happens and the media wants an interview, they reach out to a Hispanic person, like a man on the street style interview, and they speak with somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about the situation. And so she would like to see more experts and representation that way. So you heard her mention Dr. Ron Cook, and she said that she's sure that there are Hispanic doctors that could be the face of the messaging for COVID-19. So COVID-19 is the foundation for our study, but our goal is for our messaging methods to be universal. So again, that's going to come in our post interviews. We want to see how effective our messaging is. So looking through the lens of crisis communication, we aim to determine which medium and type of messaging can be highly effective in situations that may have severe health and economic implications. So continued production, HIHIC's mission to promote teaching and research that fosters understanding of Hispanic populations and improves their well-being closely aligns with the Knight Foundation's goals. So we are very fortunate to have this partnership. And we look forward to a partnership that will provide our students at Texas Tech with firsthand media experience while addressing an urgent public health need across the South Plains. And even though this is the South Plains, our study is focused here in the South Plains, it's not exclusive to the South Plains. This issue is not exclusive to the South Plains. Our goal is to link up with other organizations who have a similar mission so we can learn from one another. Crisis communication is at the crux of this. So as you can see this article here, authorities ignore Spanish speakers at Uvalde press conferences. I hate to put it in terms like that. Nobody likes to think like that, but look at the situation in Uvalde. The information that was coming from that situation was confusing enough for English speakers. Now imagine your child being inside there and speaking a different language, and nobody's addressing that. Where do you go? What do you do? How long is the wait? Where do I go for resources? COVID-19 is the starting point for this project, but crisis communication is what we are really interested in looking at. And as I mentioned earlier, this issue isn't isolated to Lubbock. So we are hoping to find common ground and looking at other grant recipients to compare our findings, okay? Another goal of mine is to work on media literacy. Everybody needs to work on media literacy. Technology is constantly changing and new platforms, new apps are being introduced on a regular basis. So we need to focus on media literacy and we need to teach people how to be informed. Doesn't matter if it's in English or in Spanish. We need both, right? And also, it's important to understand in the media, we talk about localization. What's going on within the area? But localization is within people. We need to look at these audience segments and really figure out what is it that they're interested in? What is it that they need? I think about, again, as someone who's been in industry, I think about the time I heard John Quinones from ABC speak, and Peter Jennings gave him a piece of advice when he missed an interview with a government official. John Quinones was down, and he was upset, and Peter Jennings asked him what happened, and John Quinones told him, well, I missed out on this big interview. And Peter Jennings looked at him and said, don't worry about talking to the movers and the shakers. Speak with the moved and the shaken. And so with this project, I like to think that we are doing that. We are actually speaking with people like the older man in Plainview who had lost several family members, and if I'm not mistaken, he himself was hospitalized and was in a bad situation. And he gave us a tearful interview. And when it's all said and done, when we wrap up with these interviews, it's always, wow, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you for caring about us. And so that is why this project means a lot to us, and we feel like it's critical for the community. All right, I guess, do we have time for questions? Yeah. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
What's the time frame of this project?
So we hope to wrap up production by the end of fall. So looking around December, right? And then we're going to move into the writing phase of it. Yeah. Yes.
Whenever y'all begin your own production, what network will y'all use?
So I believe Ryan has reached out to different media organizations. So we're looking, like I said, broadcast, so radio, television. I believe KCBD was one of them, KMAC, KLBK, Fox. And then, of course, we have Latino Lubbock and then Magic 106.5. So we're trying to cover all bases here.
We actually have some data on which channels, if they said TV news is a source or radio, then we follow up, which channels, and you tend to tune into local, national, or both. So we do have some data on that that will help us identify which of the stations we should really be concentrating on.
Yeah, that's a great point. So like I mentioned earlier, we have Spanish language communication with English reinforcements. So looking at like Telemundo and even social media, we are trying to create our own web-based platform to get that information out.
What kind of things would you do to see if this is actually effective? Like in phase 3, you said you'd be producing actual material. How would you look at if that's changed any opinions?
So we are going to do social media monitoring and web-based tracking to see, there's very scientific ways that we can tell, how many clicks, we can do eye tracking, see how long somebody lingers on a particular page or article even. And then we have follow-up interviews where we kind of go do what we're doing now, but we go back out and ask them, what do you think of this messaging? What was effective for you? What did you think of this representation? Was the language okay? Because another thing is the South Plains, I always tell students that we're looking at people in general, but Latino population, there's no one size fits all model. And so what works for the DFW area, what works for McAllen may not work here within the South Plains. And so that's why, we have to look beyond language, because we don't want to have, a certain type of Spanish that people within the area cannot understand and it completely turn them off. So it's all about finding that representation and identity.
If I could follow up real quickly, and that was interesting, the gentleman in Plainview who we heard the clip from, he asked to do the interview in Spanish, but then as he's telling his story, he's saying, well, I've been a member of this church for 30 years, and I have a business here in town, and I'm like, well, he must, speak English to be that engaged with the community. And it turned out his son came looking for him, and his son, completely bilingual as he was, but he preferred English. And it was interesting. I think the older gentleman selected Spanish because it's closer to sort of that emotional connection and the community and all that. And but he's perfectly bilingual. And I think those are some of the dynamics that I'm not going to say they're unique to the South Plains, but that we need to understand. And so the Harris Institute's been doing this kind of research, going out into the community, interviewing people to try to understand some of those dynamics. And so we can sort of construct a profile of the South Plains Hispanic Latinx community, and then compare with others like Professor Holt and I were talking to the Latino Policy Institute at UCLA on Friday. They're very interested in doing some coordinated research where we could then compare data gathered very similarly in Southern California and here in the South Plains. We need to sort of scale that out more nationally because we tend to have these very specific, localized studies and not an effort to try to link some of that knowledge and some of those profiles more broadly.
And I will add, we're very fortunate here in the city of Lubbock to have officials willing, and people within the health department willing to work with the population, because when you look at Plainview, it's further up north, and even though it's only like, what was it, 45 minutes, an hour away, it's almost like a media desert. And they didn't have access to a whole lot of information. In addition to that, they also had conspiracy theories and misinformation and disinformation coming from a very, very trusted source. So there was a lot of hurt. People were having to go to Amarillo to get vaccinated, and they were, lying about, I hate to say lying, but they were trying to get vaccinated at all costs by saying they had like an illness, a disease, and they were trying to find ways to get information and to get, the health care that they needed. And there was also a confusion, an element of confusion because of that trusted source. So it was almost like they felt ashamed for doing that, which is really sad. Yes.
I'm curious to see what your perspective is on the role of the physician in combating this. I'm a pre-med student.
Okay.
Sorry. In my experiment, like volunteering in clinics and working as an MA, it's difficult when you have the physician saying one thing in a Latino community, but you have public figures in the news saying another thing. And it kind of feels like a constant uphill battle and trying to fix that kind of, that difference. So what were you thinking could be a move that we could make?
It's really hard within the medical community because I know from a journalistic perspective, even if you wanted to speak with me, you have to go through a variety of channels before you can do that, or else, there can be repercussions of that. So I think another way could be, that one-on-one, representation. Another thing that was mentioned several times is, Latinos may be hesitant to reach out regarding health, medical information. And as we saw, I believe it was like a little over 20% actually did their own medical health research. So it may be hard just to even get this audience, get this group into your office. I mean, the only thing I could say is, volunteer, be an advocate, be very vocal, and anytime there's a media opportunity, say, hey, I want to, join in. I want to speak on my organization's behalf, because, with the Latino population growing, I'm willing to bet that they are going to start looking for more, Latinos to serve as the faces of these organizations. And even though, people may be saying, something completely contradictory to your messaging, the best you can do is just louder, more frequent, just keep doing, you get that messaging out there, and they're going to say what they're going to say, and they have that right, but you can make a change, you can make a difference by volunteering for that role and getting your messaging out there as frequent as possible.
Yeah, I think we were happy to see the number of people when we asked the question, where do you go if you want to check, the veracity of information? Well, doctors. A lot of, especially older people were saying doctors. And there's also this interesting dynamic with a number of the interviews. And this is preliminary. We haven't done the in-depth analysis yet, but it's sort of this, what we call in communication theory, two-step flow, where you have an opinion leader, or in this case, a medical, professional like a doctor. Folks will go to somebody they know has had some kind of medical issues and has researched well and talked to their doctors a lot as a source of information. So then if they're not communicating directly with the doctor, then they'll be communicating with a friend or family member that they trust, who they know has open communication with the doctor and would be, I guess, faithful in terms of communicating that to them. So that's another thing that's really important in all of this. We're not only focusing on media, but also on the communication dynamics within families and communities. And when we go out to these church Jamaikas, that's a built-in community. Almost everybody there is a member of that church or closely, related or associated with somebody who is. So we can ask questions about the importance of community, and they understand it because it's sort of built into the context. It was a little different at Vito because that was just, people who had showed up. It wasn't already a sort of built-in community other than being Red Raiders, I guess.
The family dynamic is important too, because a lot of times they'll have like a family member who's a nurse, and that would be the extent to which, like, then that's a medical professional they consulted with, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't really go any farther than that.
Family dynamic is super, super important, and I mentioned several times multi-generational, housing situations, and I can't even tell you, how many times we've asked the question, do you have family members, loved ones, do they trust you? Would they trust you with COVID-19 information? And sometimes the response is, pues mi hija es una enfermera, my daughter is a nurse, and so she gives me all my information, or she takes care of everything. So it's important to understand that us as, being part of the community, we're messengers too. We are all messengers, and so, it's up to us to, be responsible and do the right thing without, huge responsibility.
And some people would ask us for medical advice. Like, no,
Yes.
no.
Yeah, you're from Texas Tech. Well, yes, yeah, that too. You're from Texas Tech, so you tell me. You're, the ones from the university. So that's been kind of tough. Any other questions? All right, are we all done? Thank you guys.